Matthew 14. At that time Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people, because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They said to him, "We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied, and they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And when they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent around to all that region and brought to him all who were sick and implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. Good afternoon. Welcome back with our chapter of the day. Today we're in Matthew chapter 14. And there is a lot going on in this chapter. We begin with the story of John the Baptist, who had been arrested by Herod because he spoke very boldly about something that was wrong. That was the king having his brother's wife. And for his bold approach to speak the truth, he got himself not only landed in prison, but eventually his head was taken off. He was beheaded, he was murdered by a tyrant king because the tyrant king made a rash vow. And so you see the serious consequences in this case of following Jesus because of the hatred people had against Jesus. And that is serious for us to consider. Something we all have to ask ourselves. Am I willing to speak, to even share the gospel, to proclaim the gospel with people, to say Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one will come to the Father except through him? To say that we are all sinners, though we're made in the image of God, we have fallen, and we are in Adam, sinful, and need a Savior like Jesus. And Jesus is the only Savior of sinners. Those things these days will probably get you mocked on social media, but they probably won't get you beheaded in America. There are places in the world where that is a real threat today. But I don't live any place besides here in the United States of America. I live in the state of Maine. And while Maine is one of the least churched states in our country, it's not likely I'm going to get my head taken off for telling someone not to commit adultery. It's not likely that I'm going to stand out and say that abortion is murder and have someone actually physically harm me for that. They may stalk me on social media or make idle threats at times. But there are babies being killed, and so I have to speak. And so that's something that as a family we do speak about. And we need to be mindful to not go looking to pick fights with everybody. We also need to be mindful that we are not here as a popularity contest in this world. We're here to be ambassadors of Jesus. We are to be proclaimers of his gospel. And so we need to be bold in what we say. We need to be wise, but we need to be bold in what we say. So that's the first part of this chapter, and that made me think an awful lot about things going on in our lives today. And maybe I'll share more about what's going on in our lives in another video. But the second part of this chapter, you see Jesus feeding 5,000 men, plus women and children, so probably, 15,000, 20,000 people. At least 5,000 at the very minimum, 5,000 people fed with 5 ordinary loaves of bread and 2 ordinary fish. That would be the average, maybe a person or a family's lunch. And Jesus, because of his power as God, he made the world by speaking it into existence. He can certainly cause bread and fish to multiply, to satisfy and fill the bellies of these people who had come to hear him speak. And so we do learn a little bit today. We've talked before about Jesus having power and authority. We've talked about him casting out demons and healing the sick. But here we see miracles such as creating food. And not just a little bit of food for everybody, where everybody gets a crumb and split it up into small pieces, but they were all satisfied. And in other accounts of the 5,000 being fed, and another account where a different group of about 4,000 was fed, and again, that was men beyond women and children, probably a lot more people than that. It was miraculous. It says that they were satisfied and then they gathered up baskets full. In Mark's gospel, you see that they gathered up baskets full after taking this small lunch, feeding thousands of people. This is the power of God. He speaks things into existence. And so we worship a God that is a lot bigger than our imagination might be. And when we're coming to circumstances where we say, I feel like I need to speak on behalf of God and tell people this message from the Lord, that fear that we have is irrational, because if God is for us, even if they execute us, as they did all of the disciples for preaching the gospel, that's not a very likely fear in our day and age. And then we come to a very rational fear in the last part of the chapter, where Peter, a fisherman who's been out on the water most of his life and seems to have made his living as a fisherman most of his life, whose father was also a fisherman, and his brother was a fisherman, out in a boat in a storm, and Jesus is walking on water. They've never seen anyone walk on the water before. And so Peter says, Lord, if it's you, have me come to you. And he does go to him. And so he has the faith. A lot of times we pick on Peter. He has the doubt because he then sinks and Jesus has to rescue him. But think about the faith that Peter had to get out of that boat. A fisherman stepping off the security of a boat in a storm and trusting that this man who he's following, the Messiah that has been promised, the one that he has seen do these miraculous things and have the power of God, to know who he is, Peter got out of that boat and he followed Jesus. So for me, that is something that convicts me, that I need to think, are there things that I can do in the flesh? Good, I should do those things to the honor and glory of God. But are there things that I don't think I'm capable of, that God can empower me to do? And so today, I don't know what your thing is. I know what my thing is. I know what God's working on me, but I would encourage you to ask God what it is he wants you to do, and then ask him to equip you and to give you the faith to obey him in whatever that is today. We'll see you tomorrow for another chapter, Matthew 15.